Hello. Thank you all. I feel really honored to go after that presentation because I think they not only represented, the praxis and the agency that I think I'm going to talk about a little bit in the work that we do, but a real understanding of the kind of pressure and stress and challenges that the next generation are facing, which was a huge impetus for the work I do and the practice that I'm going to talk about in a second. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the work and some of the macro trends that are informing the lives of kids and families. And then the best part is going to be that my son is going to do a bit of an interview where we're going to have an intergenerational dialogue together. So we've never done this before, so it is very unfinished in terms of a practice, but I think it's going to be interesting. It's been really interesting for us to brainstorm and come up with the questions, and so I hope it's also going to be quite interesting for the audience. So my talk is called Raising the Future because it was very much a personal experience with being a mother, being a designer, and being an entrepreneur, and wanting to find, I guess, what we're calling in this conference praxis, a way of creating action out of all these challenges that families are currently facing in the world. I'll talk a little bit about my background just to give you some context to start with, and then I'll dive into some of the macro trends that are informing the lives of kids and families. So I come from Los Angeles originally. If anyone went to Lior's talk yesterday, a very car-centric environment where nature was really something we visited, not something that was innately a part of our relationship, which led me to move to New York and Providence, where I was educated in design practice and design methodologies, where I really gained an understanding of design as a tool for solving problems, which was really important for me. And then I was fortunate enough to move to Italy, to a place called Fabrica, which is a creative research center. There have been a few speakers, actually, from Fabrica that have spoken. But I think what I really learned in Italy was how to live, that there was this difference between working to live and living to live, and that was an important part of my kind of development. And I moved to the UK, where I was, I think, in the right place at the right time with resources to support entrepreneurship, which is where I started my first business, where I had my children, and really was the spark for, I think, this next cycle of my life and practice. And most recently, as part of this journey, we've kind of made a big choice as a family to, I guess, like walk the talk. That's a lot of the dialogue that's been happening over the last few days. This real innate feeling of feeling disconnected from the natural world and what it might be like as a family to not be a visitor of nature, but to be accessing and integrated into nature in a really fundamental way. So we've moved to the countryside. We now have neighbors that are cows and birds as opposed to lots of humans. And it's really changed our life as a family. And so I'm going to talk about how that's informed my work, but then Ash and I will have a dialogue about how that's really transformed our families as well. So the reason I even think about education is because I grew up in a Montessori household. I don't know if anyone knows Montessori. Maybe raise your hand. So a few people know Montessori. So for those of you that don't know, Montessori is this unbelievable methodology of learning. It was developed by a woman named Maria Montessori, who is like the polymath of education. She's kind of like the Buckminster Fuller of learning. She didn't just develop an approach, she developed tools, facilitation tools, products that look like contemporary art. I mean, she developed this unbelievable comprehensive methodology of learning. She was a doctor, a psychologist, and I think we would probably have called her a designer. I don't think that was a word that she would have used, but we would call her that. And the methodology was really about creating independence and child agency. And agency is, honestly, it's another word for praxis. It's how do you translate kind of theoretical experience into action? And she was a believer that even the youngest children had the capacity, the skills, and the autonomy to make choices and to learn. And my journey really led me, entrepreneurial-wise, into starting my own business when I had my first child. So I had my first son, and I think I went to the toy department for the first time since I was a child. And for those of you that have kids, you may have had this experience. It was really depressing. It was incredibly gendered. It was, honestly, like, this industry is serving the next generation in a way that's a little bit offensive. It was really like plastic, overstimulating. It just didn't have the soul and, quite frankly, the connection with the way technology is unfolding that felt appropriate for the generation that's actually emerging. And so we did what totally insane entrepreneurs do. We decided to start a business, which was an educational toy business called Tech Will Save Us, that created essentially STEM and STEAM products, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths, products that allowed kids to make, play, code, and invent their own products, basically. And they didn't make them because they wanted to learn coding. They made them because they wanted to make a gaming device that would do the games that they designed and programmed, or they wanted to make an electric guitar out of cardboard and rubber bands. So it was never about the tech. It was about what you could do with the technology. And I think what that journey really gave me a sense about was an audience that was really underserved. Children are not treated like citizens. And I think after the conversation we just had and the unbelievable, I think, kind of like real disconnection and lack of trust that young people have with the authority figures and adults that are essentially trying to serve them or supposed to serve them, there is a real lack of trust in young people, and they're really not treated like citizens. There are not many spaces where their voice is heard or even welcome. There are not many places where we ask them for their opinion about anything, quite frankly, including their schooling. And so this really gave me the sense of, like, why are we not including young people in problem solving and solution finding and, quite frankly, imagining the future in any way? And the other audience it gave me a real insight in were parents. Parents are basically treated like a wallet in a friction point in a transaction. And honestly, as a parent, and anyone that is a parent, like, wow, we're literally raising the next generation. No one is giving us any tools to do that. No one is helping us understand what's happening with our children, how to support them. And this treatment of parents as this wallet just felt unbelievably dissatisfying for what is probably one of the most important roles in society, which is stewarding the next generation. And so that's really what led me to starting my next venture, which is called FAM Studio. So it's called FAM because it's about families. And I'll talk a little bit about what we do and why we do it. And I just thought I'd mention this quote because it just feels like it encompasses mainly everything that's been talked about. But I fundamentally have always believed and still believe that the changes that really do happen are because some group of committed people decide that that's what they're going to focus on. And sometimes it's against all odds, and sometimes it's very risky, but ultimately it is what ultimately changes, I think, society in important ways. So I will paint a picture of childhood a little bit for all of us to understand the kind of trends that are happening. So 25% of the world's population is under 15. That is an enormous part of the population that is not included in decision-making in any way, shape, or form until they're legal and able to vote, which is interesting. The average child spends about 4 hours outside a week, which again is an interesting, I think, example of priorities and what we think is important for children, whether that's because parents are not allowing it, whether that's because children don't want it, whether that's because it's just not a priority for people. There are many reasons why that might be the case. And the final stat, which is always depressing to say aloud, there was a recent Lancet report, a peer-reviewed report from 10,000 young people from 47 countries, and 75% of them said that the future is frightening. And there was I think it was something like 45% of them, these are like 11 and 12-year-olds, were already deciding that they didn't want to have children, because why would they? The future was just so scary. And that in itself is just a really kind of confronting reality, that we're raising a generation that is really frightened about the future. And our opinion is it might not be so much about the topics, but that it's that they have no agency, that there's no way of them knowing that they can do something about it. Ivor and his partner talked about school and civic engagement. Where are the places for children to learn about how they bring their voices into these kind of adult spaces? So this is a real challenge that's happening in the world. Families are also impacted by this in unprecedented ways, whether it's the cost of living crisis, whether it's the rising costs of energy, whether it's climate change impacting their lives. There is just increasing stress and frustration within families. And again, these are the adults that are ultimately raising young people. And there's a desire for action, but not a lot of access to practical things that families can do. And because of this lack of practical kind of inspiring ways to live in harmony with nature and live in different ways, it's just exacerbating the situation and creating, quite frankly, unchanged behaviors. I mean, as a parent, the stress is real. It's really hard to raise a family for all kinds of reasons. And organizations and governments are not really providing adequate solutions. And so what's ultimately happening is an enormous gap between families and the organizations, the governments that are supposed to be serving them. And that is resulting in a lack of trust. And if you don't trust the organizations that are serving you, it's really hard to engage with each other. And as we know, families are living in real challenges. I mean, climate change activities, people are having floods and fires and all kinds of activities in their lives that were just never happening before. Children are leaving on Fridays from school to encourage adults who are supposed to be representing them to actually do something more significant in the world because no one is doing what they think is most appropriate. The mental health crisis is significant for kids, but it's also significant for parents. Parents are really struggling with raising families and actually trying to raise their children in ways that are appropriate to their values. And I promise this whole presentation is not just doom and gloom. There are bright hopes, and that's partially why we started FAM, because there are some amazing examples of bright sparks all over the world that are trying to really impact all of the kind of, what we like to call kind of social acupuncture. These pockets of experiences that are kind of releasing new kinds of energy, new ways of doing things, coming from private, public, and social sector. So whether it be, we were just talking about politics, there's a beautiful organization called Civic Square, which is based in the UK. They use donut economics in public settings and in school settings to teach young people, families, and communities how to be active participants in civic society through action, through planning. I think there's a misconception that these kind of complex systems kids won't understand or they won't have the vocabulary. But we don't try, and so they don't have spaces to try these new tools. There's some beautiful examples in India. So the happiness curriculum was launched last year. It is now reaching over 1 million kids across India, and it includes meditation and mindfulness activities as part of state school national curriculum. And there are other beautiful organizations. People must know of forest schools. Now in the UK, 4 out of 5 schools have some kind of forest school activity within the school. Sometimes it's a very small space, like a mud kitchen, and sometimes in its entire forest near the school that just hasn't been utilized by the school in years. So there are changes and activities happening, which is beautiful. And that is essentially what we want to be a part of, is creating as many examples and as many shifts that will support this next generation. And that's where our kind of mission, and I think my personal mission comes from, that all children and families have the opportunity to thrive in these uncertain times. And when we say the word family, we mean the village that's raising the family. There's always a village. This nuclear family model is quite a new model. It's not really serving everyone. And so the village might be extended family, it might be hired family because they don't have resources in their country. It might be chosen family that has now surrounded that group of people, but there is always a village. It definitely includes teachers in some way as well. And our mission is really generational because the impact that we hope to see may not happen in our lifetime. We may not see all of the impacts, and that's part of the work. And we really believe that there are a few specific shifts that if we really try and create these shifts for as many families as possible, no matter what culture you're from, no matter what your economic background, no matter what your circumstances is, they will create pretty rich conditions for thriving. And so those shifts basically go from this idea of passive engagement. I know that we talk a lot about kind of, consumers have the power to make purchases, to change things, and that is true. However, we think there's a shift from being a consumer to being a citizen, a really creative citizen, and children definitely need to be part of that shift, and families. Moving from this linear subject matter way that we educate currently, which if you ask most children, they don't think it's working either, to a much more expansive way of learning, which may include intergenerational learning. It may include project-based learning, place-based learning, embodied learning. There are many ways that learning can and should happen, and our current systems really don't allow for that. It's essentially a hangover from the Industrial Revolution. When you think about the system, it's essentially educating children to be factory workers, which is not really what their future is most likely going to be. And then the last is this disconnection from nature. And when we talk about this, this is really about seeing ourselves as nature, not as separate from it, but humans being a part of the natural world and ecosystem. And we do a lot of experiments around what that might look like. And so very intentionally, we structure our work around research and a studio practice. And I think the reason we do this is because purely practical application can sometimes be really focused on commercial outcomes. And when you're trying to commercialize something quickly, that doesn't always give you the space to explore the depth of what's required. So we have a whole research side of our organization that's purely focused on discovery. And we take a lot of that research. We work with a lot of academic partners around the world, Berkeley University, the Creative Computing Institute in the UK, Max Planck Institute. So we work with some really interesting academic partners, sometimes translating their research into frameworks that we can use in practical applications, and sometimes doing kind of primary research together around new subjects. And we have a really interesting collection of subjects that we've been exploring for the last 3 years. I won't go through all of them, but I'll talk about a few that are, I think, really fascinating. So one is Young Futures. And Young Futures is really about bringing the voice of young people into futures and speculative processes. So for those that don't know, speculative or futures processes, I mean, we've seen a lot of it over the last few days. It's the capacity to think and imagine futures that are usually much farther out than 3 or 5 years. And in order to do that, we create a program that helps young people to learn something called futures literacy. It's the capacity to even think about futures. And that's not that easy when you've never been asked about the future, except for maybe what you want to be when you grow up. Kids tend to be asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? What are you going to do for school? Not many people ask them, what do you think the future should be? What would you like the future to look like? There's not a lot of space for that. So we go through this process of creating kind of frameworks around futures literacy, and then we include generative AI as a way for them to collaborate and imagine their future, or a future. Interspecies play is a really fun one. I like this one. So this is one that we've been doing with Max Planck Institute. They do really interesting work about more than human communication using AI, where they're helping communicate with fish and spiders. And what's been really interesting about this investigation is when you think about play, it requires a certain level of intelligence to understand the rules or the interactions. And when you include other species in that play pattern, it actually really encourages kids to think about what is intelligence at all, which we think is a really interesting question for a generation that is ultimately going to grow up in a world full of AI, where intelligence is kind of put in a box around a certain kind of academic, very specific intelligence. And when you include play in that, it's no longer just about the intelligence that we think comes from books and science and math. It's actually contextual. If you play a game in water, the intelligence that you need to do something in water is very different than if you're playing a game on land or in the sky or in another context. And so this experiment with play is really us investigating what might it look like if children actually played with the more than human world. How might that change their understanding of intelligence, of the natural world? It's something that kids literally, you don't have to ask them to do it. They naturally want to play. So these are the types of areas that we investigate. And then we generally translate that into real, practical products, experiences, things, pedagogies, curriculum that allow families to go on a journey. We really want to see this kind of shift from more kind of sustainable language and practice to something much more replenishing and restorative and regenerative, which addresses the complexity of what kids and families are actually going through. And so just a few examples of what that looks like in practice. So sometimes we're working with a private sector organization developing, for example, an augmented reality app where we've brought in Derby University, who has this really amazing work on nature connection. There are 5 dimensions to the connection with nature, and it turns out it's not about time. Your connection with nature is not about how long you spend in nature, it's about the quality of what you're doing in nature. It's sparked by senses, it's sparked by beauty, it's sparked by meaning, it's sparked by myth. And so in this app that we've created for children that uses augmented reality, the whole premise of it is not about time, it's about sparking these nature connection, what we call kind of triggers, that allow kids to really explore their senses and explore different parts of their relationship to the natural world. Sometimes it includes co-creation. In fact, most of the time it includes co-creation. So the image on the bottom left is a co-creation workshop we did in a rural community in Africa, where we're developing a physical and digital product that actually creates distributed solar power in rural communities across Kigali. And in order to do that, what we've identified is actually that young people play an enormous role in energy consumption. And so their role in this product experience is actually making, creating, building, and ultimately maintaining this solar hub that they will have made with their families. So it not only teaches them engineering and STEM skills, but it teaches them about energy and regenerative energy principles, which again is a really interesting part of our process and work. And sometimes it's an experience or a pedagogy or a program where we design an actual curriculum for either a kind of education organization with a capital E, like a government or a council, and sometimes it's for outside of traditional education, a charity, an NGO, etc. So our medium, very intentionally, is varied, because we don't want these things to be translated into a particular type of medium. The medium should be the most appropriate thing for what's going to support the most amount of kids and families to experience whatever the quality or the thing is that we're trying to develop. And we work across ages and stages, because there is never a moment where it's not worth kind of injecting, reviewing, reflecting on how you might impact a young person's life, whatever stage that might be. We even work kind of pre-pregnancy, so that it's about really enhancing and understanding what is happening in a family's life before even embarking on that journey. So, final part of the conversation, and then we are going to sit down with Ash and hopefully talk about these topics. So there are 4 areas that are really intriguing kind of me and us right now, and I thought I'd just talk a little bit about each of them, and then we can sit down and have a chat. So the first is the importance of early years. So I don't know if many people, do people know the terminology early years? Is that something that anyone has heard of? So early years refers to 0 to 5. It is one of the most critical stages of human development. It is unbelievably important to our thriving and ultimate, kind of sense of self as we get older. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how much it's been forgotten and also why it's so important. I'm going to talk about the science of play, there's been a lot of dialogue about play, which has been really wonderful to see. And I think what's interesting about play is that it really is a science, and that things are happening in the brain when young people are playing that are critical for their development. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and why we are so passionate about play as a principle in our work. I'm going to talk about childhood and AI a little bit. And then lastly, a kind of radically collaborative, life-centered approach to development. I never really thought I would find myself working with governments and policymakers. That was not really like my ambition in design school. But now that we're doing it, and now that we have this really collaborative way of working, I actually can't see a way in which we would make any kind of change without that really multi-stakeholder process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like and why that's so important. So early years. So by the age of 2, our brains are essentially 80% of the weight of an adult, and by 5, they are 90% the size, which means your brain is basically completely formed by the time you're 5, which is insane. Basically, millions of connections and synapses have developed. Your sense of identity, your cognitive development, your organs speaking to your brain, all of that is shaping from 0 to 5. And what's really shocking is the amount of money we spend on higher education. So university level education, professors, which is important and critical, but we spend a significant amount of money on that stage. And arguably, young people in their 20s could probably find programs online and have a self-directed course that's pretty significant. I'm not saying we should defund higher education, by the way. I'm just saying the proportion of what we spend there versus what we spend on early years is insane. Nursery school teachers, early years teachers are paid nothing. There's a crisis of even finding nursery school teachers. There is barely any free nursery education in any country, in any part of the world. This part of human development is so under-resourced. It is unbelievable. And we have so much research. We know this. We've known this for a long time. It's just so under-resourced. And there is some economic benefit. The kind of current stat is there's an 8-to-1 return on investment. For every dollar we spend on early education, we get 8 times the return. Reduced mental health, better physical and cognitive development, better capacity to learn and self-regulate. All of this investment is really not happening. And there are some changes, which is really exciting. However, it's an area that's just so underserved and so important. So the second area is the science of play. And I love this one. This is really interesting. So play is the act of engaging in an activity for the pure enjoyment and experience of joy without any necessary outcome. That's basically the definition of play. We probably all do it in some way, shape, or form. We just don't know we're doing it. And kids do it really effortlessly. And the science of play, there's a really beautiful pyramid that one of our partners developed named Caroline Asame. She's an occupational therapist and a researcher. And play happens in a structure, actually. And there are 4 different developmental parts of play. And they are cumulative, which means the bottom creates the conditions for the top to happen. And you can always cycle back, you can always go back to different areas, but without the bottom infrastructure, the top is very hard to achieve. So I'm going to just show you a little bit of what that looks like. So the bottom is sensory play and movement-based play. And sensory play is basically really talking about the 6 senses. Yes, I said 6. So there's the ones we know, sight, taste, touch, smell, hearing. And then there's proprioception, which is understanding our body in space. So when you see kids moving around, wanting to wiggle and shake, and they're literally trying to find their body in space. This is a critical part of us understanding ourselves in the world. So when we're telling kids to sit down, stop moving, stop shaking, putting them in a chair to sit down while they're learning, it is literally stopping connections in their brain from forming. It is kind of crazy that we do that to children. Also, adults need to move, by the way. The second area is creative exploratory play, which is making a mess. we need to make messes. We need to see things in space. We need to kind of play and explore and not be constricted. And again, and I've done this, so I feel parents, when we tell our kids, like, don't make a mess, clean it up immediately, we're like, spraying like, antibacterial around them. We are preventing this exploratory part of their brains from developing, which could be really detrimental. And well, not just detrimental, I'll show you what actually happens. So the next one is meaning making. This one's really lovely. This is where we're essentially creating organization out of mess. So I'm organizing my peas on my plate, or I'm matching my toys in a certain color, or I'm putting my shoes in a certain order, or I'm doing a puzzle. So this meaning-making play is really significant and important, specifically for fine motor control skills, for spatial awareness, which is like the beginning of maths skills. So this is a really critical part of development. And then the last, which is higher play, this is imaginative play. This is I make my own rules, I decide what's going to happen, and this is how the game or the play pattern unfolds. And it doesn't have to make sense to anyone but me, but this is the imaginative play, and this is also where academic acquisition and intellectual acquisition happens. So what we find is a lot of organizations are focused on the top. Like all the ed tech businesses are trying to get everyone to learn things through these like gamified, imaginative experiences without acknowledging that there might be, and by the way there are, a whole bunch of young people that have never had sensorial play or never been able to make a mess. And so their brains, so the two images on the right, this is a study that was actually done in Romania. This is a study of what a brain looks like that's fully developed, where all the rungs of play have happened several times, all the synapses are forming, and there's a lot of connection happening in the brain. The right is when that hasn't happened. There's huge parts of the frontal lobe, of the neocortex that just haven't had a chance to develop, which means attainment of academic knowledge is much harder. And the good thing is you can go back in the different rungs and you can build those capacities. That's what occupational therapists do. That's what people that support ADHD do. But a lot of teachers don't know this. And I mean, as a parent, I didn't know this. How is this not something that anyone that's interacting with children has capacity to, has training around, has the knowledge to do? We're just not giving our kids the best chance to thrive if we're not giving them a chance to actually experience all these rungs of play. So the last two I'll do very quickly. So this is, I was talking earlier about young futures. AI is an enormous conversation, as it should be. It's a big topic in the world, and it's a big topic for children because it's going to be a transformational technology and experience that will be part of their lives. And a lot of governments' approach to how they're managing this is by basically banning it from children. Basically saying, it's too safe, it's too dangerous, it's too unknown, it's too uncertain, and so you can't use it at all. And we're not saying that safety is not critical and that understanding the parameters of AI aren't really important. But the solution is definitely not to ban children from interacting, understanding, and having literacy around the role that AI will have in their lives. And so the way we've been experimenting with it is through a partnership with the Creative Computing Institute, the Alan Turing Institute, and the innovation sector of the government, to basically help young people to use it as a tool for imagining and bringing their voice, their perspective into strategic decision-making processes. Whether that be in their education system, what might your school curriculum or school look like and feel like in the future? What might your community or your space look like in the future? It's a way of really collaborating with AI to see it as a tool for expression and creativity. And what really happens in these workshops and in these experiences is you see a real sense of agency from young people, a chance to really interrogate and investigate some of the big challenges that they see around them, and to really envision what some of those solutions might look like. And because we're not relying on their ability to draw, or their ability to write, or their ability to articulate something in a way that adults might be comfortable with, it actually creates a much more equal and equitable approach for young people to bring their voice into these processes, because they're not limited by, I'm a bad drawer, or I don't know what to say, or I don't know how to say this. They actually have a tool which is their essential assistant that supports them in envisioning and imagining some of these futures. And these are just some of the examples that we've done. We've worked with 5 different schools around the UK. About 1,000 students have participated in it. So it's still early days, but it's a really interesting way of investigating and leveraging this technology in a way that creates a sense of literacy, but also a kind of sense of agency around this important technology. And last but not least, so we work and we want to work across public, private, and social sector, because these solutions for young people and families is not going to come from one area. Some public sector organization is not going to have the capacity to be agile enough and quick enough and, quite frankly, experimental enough to create some of these solutions. Another will private sector. And another component that's really critical to our process is including families and young people from the beginning of processes, not as a tokenistic part at the end of a process, which is often what happens. Children are brought in to kind of rigor test something that we've already decided works, or to see if that UX actually works with their retention and engagement, as opposed to a fundamental part at the early stage of the process. So the process is really multi-stakeholder. It includes technologists, researchers, policymakers, designers, families, and sometimes nature. Sometimes we have someone that's representative of the natural world in a process that allows us to really experiment with all of these stakeholders and all of their perspectives in order to create more restorative, replenishing outcomes for kids and families. So I hope that gives a sense of some of the work and areas that I'm investigating. And now we're going to have a bit of a chat. So Ash, my 12-year-old, and I had a brainstorm a couple of weeks ago or days ago, where we just started to talk about some of these topics and some of these areas. And Ash came up with a bunch of questions that we just have on the screen. There's no order or specific way in which we're going to do it. We thought we would just sit down and have a kind of back and forth, asking each other some questions about some of these topics, and then hopefully have a little bit of space for some questions after. You want to sit on this side? Do you need I think he needs a microphone. So we've never done this, so be kind.
Good monologues.
Okay. Ash, do you wanna start?
So much material. I bet.
And world, and very little of it is good enough to publish.
Mm-hmm.
When he first said, "Well, let's use local stuff," and I was like, "It's going to,
Hello.
volume alone."
So I'd like to start off with asking you that most people talk quite negatively about kids and smartphones and technology and at an early age, especially cell phones and social media. Mm-hmm. And what do you think would be a good compromise for kids and really their parents to be able to still have these tech experiences, but also
Instagram for under 18-year-olds.
not be limited in that sense?
I think there's a microphone on somewhere. Maybe. Good question. So, and I'll ask you maybe the same question after, because I think it's good for you to also answer it. So, I mean, I think there's a few things. I think we're in this paradigm right now where the smartphone is like the definition of technology. When we say technology, people tend to refer to a smartphone or a screen, which is a very small, dimension of what technology is. And I think the smartphone connected to social media is a slightly different question than how do we use technology in our lives? How do kids use technology in school? How do kids use technology as a problem-solving tool? And so I think what I'd love to see is more of a decoupling of the parts of technology that we're worried about, which are very fair and very appropriate to be worried about, really ring-fencing that usage of smartphones and social media to a very particular area, as opposed to then that translating that into the education system and into everyday life and saying that all technology is bad and that all technology is going to negatively impact our children, because I just don't believe that's true. Yeah. I think social media is problematic, and I think smartphones are problematic, but I don't think the use of technology in like creative, imaginative, interesting ways, especially in school, is problematic at all. In fact, I think it's necessary. So that's what's your answer?
I'd probably say that the smartphone has become the face of technology. Like, it's the thing that everyone, whenever you say, hey, what pieces of tech do you have? Most people always start with the smartphone. It's what their brain just jumps to immediately. And I think that social media is completely different. And it needs to be restricted if it is needed to, and it should have that ability without making the child or even a teenager think that something has been taken away from them. Because I think that the real problem is people have social media, and then when it is restricted with like screen time bans and stuff like that, it feels like you're being controlled or forced to do something. And I just don't think that's fair.
Interesting. Good job. Shall I ask you a question now?
Sure.
So, I like this one. What do you think are the jobs for the future for kids like you? And how might the job market change for you? What do you think, what is like a job going to be for you in the future? What do you think about working as part of your future? How might it be different than what you've seen me and Dad and other people doing?
Well, I've been learning about something called localized farming. And if you don't know what that is, localized farming is going from mass producing food and livestock to making sure everything's close, which actually makes less pollution, less fertilizers, like just it's better in every way, I'd say. And I also found out that if we do switch even just 50% of our global farms to localized farming, you would get 3 times the amount of jobs. And I just think that if that is the case with just farming, I think in all the other industries of design and IT and everything else also have changes to be made that could 3x, 4x, 5x the amount of jobs. And I think those jobs would be better because everyone then would, I'd say, have more of a sustainable feeling, and everyone would know how to be sustainable. And I just think that in the future, my generation and the generations later are going to be in a very alien world. And I think that we're going to have to adapt and evolve to that world. And I hope that we'll do a good job.
Sure you will.
Chilly.
I like the idea of more localized jobs and relationships to your local community. I think that's an important thing that doesn't exist a lot for people that are working, unless you're working specifically in a local organization.
Well, I guess you should have a turn again then. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think are the jobs for the future?
Same question.
More or less, but specifically to accommodate for mental needs, desires, and big uncertainties like climate crisis.
Yeah, I've thought about this. Sometimes I see myself and my generation working so hard, like constantly working. And I sometimes think that your generation is going to look at us and be like, why did you guys do that? Why did you sacrifice so much? Why did you ignore your family, your relationships, your friends? I mean, I do see that happening so much. And I often think that you guys are going to look at us and say, there was a different way to do this. You didn't Yeah, you didn't have to do it like that. And that there will be a real reckoning of a much more holistic, hopefully, and I mean sustainable in the kind of sustaining sort of way, that your generation will have a different balance between work and life, and an approach, and also not just an approach, an incentive to actually be more like that. Because I think my generation is incentivized to work hard, almost that burnout is like a badge of honor. And I think that's unraveling right now, which is great. And I think it's my generation that's unraveling with. But I think your generation, it's almost like you'll look back at it like cigarettes and be like, that was just not a good idea. You guys were killing yourself. So I really hope that is the case. And I think AI will have something to do with that. I think localization will have something. I think there's a lot of systems that will change, that will support that. But I think your generation, and we will probably look back and be like, that was not cool at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we?
I think we've got maybe one more.
Should we ask one more? Do we have time for one more question? Yes? Okay, we'll ask one more question. Okay. Well, this is more your question, but so there was another question on our screen, which I really liked, around nature and moving from an urban city to a rural community. I wanted to ask you about that. You know, what was it like to live in a rural, nature-based community now rather than in an urban city? You were born in a city, you've always lived in cities. You know, I'm from a city, your father's from a city. How has that changed for you? What is your experience with that?
I think that in a city, or I've grown up in quite a nice, I would say, family, and you've really...
I'm glad you said that.
I think that you've really helped me stay connected with nature and wildlife, even being in a city. And I'd like to thank you for that, one. And two, I would say that... I'd say that we've always been connected to nature, but moving to a rural environment has changed the perspective, and I felt that now we're not spectators of it, but we are what's being spectated. We are with the wildlife. We are together with it. We are not apart from nature, but we are nature. And I find that quite amazing. Like from the stone we're on right now to, I don't know, the plastic up there, it's all natural. It's all from the periodic table. Everything is an element, tracing it back to its original form. And so that connection that I've had, I think, has deepened. And I think I now have a few more connections with nature and other things that I think have branched off from that. So I think it's changed my perspective on nature and really helped me see what I can actually achieve if I wanted to.
Do you have any practical examples that like have shifted for you?
I think that being in Somerset, you have to, like, when we lived in London, you would just, well, at least I would have thrown most of my trash in the same bin. But in Somerset, we do, like, almost daily organisation, just making sure that everything is in its correct place, making sure recycling's in the recycling, making sure waste is in the waste bin. And I think that's amazing because it means that we're really elongating the life of our planet, because everyone seems to be, maybe not knowingly, destroying the planet. And I think doing that little part and seeing if everyone else will then see that makes all the difference, because you can then, a bit like a butterfly effect, when one person sees it, they tell their 5 friends about it, and then each of those 5 friends tell their 5 friends, and then it's just exponentially growing. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, we're gonna stop. Thank you, Ash.
Thank you.
That was cool.